freedom fighters, freedom lovers, and those who just want stuff for free. Greetings and hello. It is I, your favorite obscure social studies teacher, with just enough expertise to make things interesting, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, folks. You're tuning in, and I appreciate it, so thank you. Tuning in, thank you. I appreciate it. You know, it's been a while. I know that I haven't dropped a podcast in a while, but I have, school started about 3 weeks ago, and I have been a busy little bee. But alas, today, on a special Saturday edition of the Professor Liberty Podcast, I thought we would talk a little political philosophy. Yay! If you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Send me your questions, your comments, your concerns, your quandaries, your criticisms, whatever you want to send me. Just make sure it's appropriate at professorliberty1776@gmail.com. And if you guys want to really, my birthday's coming up. I wasn't going to share this, but my birthday's coming up. My birthday is Labor Day. If you guys want to get Professor Liberty a present, share the podcast. Talk about the podcast. Share the podcast. Give me some more ideas on Facebook. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter, otherwise known as X, and help me retire from the classroom, which I would love to do, and become Professor Liberty full-time. Boy, wouldn't that be a great birthday present? Okay, on to today's episode, which I call Rome, not Greece. I don't know. Maybe that's not a good title. Maybe we should call it Rome, Athens, and the Constitution. That sounds better. We'll go with that. How's it going out there, folks? Boy, it is interesting. It's getting really weird here in the United States, isn't it? Welcome to the last days of the Republic. I feel like this political season is something out of a Saturday Night Live skit. It seems democracy is on its way out through the actions and policies that are meant to, quote, save it, unquote. And the ignorant masses are looking up from their screens just long enough so they can cast their vote for the one of the two demagogues provided to them. It's pretty depressing overall, and so when I start feeling depressed, I decide it's time to make a podcast. So in government class, the past few weeks, we've been discussing the foundations of American government. And we've been talking about the Declaration of Independence. And we've been talking about the Constitution. And we've been talking about federalism. And so I thought, why not do a podcast on the ancient influences of our American system? So who did our framers to the Constitution look to when they were trying to find influence and inspiration to make a new charter for this nation? Who did they draw upon? What ideas did they embrace? And what ideas did they try to prevent or try to repress? Now, I know some history guy out there is going to say, I didn't talk about the Iroquois Confederation and Ben Franklin. I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to talk about are the two classical sources, the two classical ancient foundations upon which our government system is founded. And that is ancient Greece and the Roman Republic. Now, if you're consuming any media today, all we hear about is democracy. All this democracy. We have to fight for democracy. We have to save democracy. We love democracy. We worship democracy. But you might be surprised to know that of these two ancient foundations, one was a good example and one was a bad example. And democracy was on the bad side. So let's start with ancient Greece first. Most specifically, let's talk about Athens. Athens is hailed as the birthplace of democracy. I often tell my class that technically, even though Greece is Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe, we like to clump Greece into Western Europe, or as we say, the West, because of the democracy, the democratic ideals that Greece brought to the continent of Europe and Western civilization. However, when you're talking about Athenian democracy, the peanut butter and jelly is the Greek tyrant. And we're going to talk about that. So let's start with the tyrant Pisistratus. And I know I'm saying that wrong, but we're going to go with that. He ruled around the 6th century BC, and Pisistratus wasn't your typical tyrant. He didn't come to power through violent rebellion. Instead, he used a mix of popular support and strategic political moves to seize control. That doesn't sound familiar. His reign was significant in the sense that he centralized power. We're going to talk about that. And while Pisistratus did implement some reforms, he kept some of his campaign promises, wink, wink. Once in power, Pisistratus consolidated his rule, and he governed with an iron fist. And Pisistratus isn't the only tyrant in this long history of democracy. There's also Polycrates, who existed in the mid-500s BC. He was a military commander who became a tyrant of the Greek island of Samos. He used his military prowess as well as some political maneuvering to gain control. Now, initially, he was a military commander who successfully overthrew the existing government. So that would be a revolution, that would be a coup d'etat, right? The reason he's important to bring up is because his rise marked his ability, or let's just take any power-hungry individual's ability, to capitalize on the instability and power struggles that democracy often brings. There's also Dionysius I. He rose to power in Syracuse during a period of political instability and factional conflict. He was appointed first as commander to address, he's going to vote for him. This guy's going to make it right. He became commander to address the internal discord, but he capitalized on this and seized control for himself. Throughout history, the military commander becoming dictator is one of the most overplayed, copied cycles on loop that we've ever seen. Now, the Greek word for tyrant originally didn't mean the same as it means today. In ancient Greece, tyrant simply meant someone who seized power unconstitutionally, often outside the traditional framework of governance. It didn't necessarily imply that you were a cruel despot, though many tyrants ended up being that way anyway. In contrast, the modern sense of tyrant is much more negative, implying that a ruler who is cruel, oppressive, and unjust. Being heavily influenced by classical Greco-Roman thinking, the founding fathers saw tyranny as someone who was abusing power or ruling unjustly. Or, we could just steal a little bit from the Declaration of Independence, someone who is, quote, violating the laws of nature, unquote. However, I must say that just because someone is labeled a, quote, tyrant doesn't mean they weren't popular in the eyes of the masses. Julius Caesar, Adolf Hitler, Napoleon Bonaparte, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez down in Venezuela. All these people were popular, and some still are very popular in the eyes of many today. And why is that? Well, obviously there's many reasons, but I want to focus on these people all promise things. They promise peace and safety. They promise food, bread, circuses. They promise $25,000 for a down payment on a house. Does that sound familiar? That was just proposed a couple days ago. They promise free Obama phones. And they promise hope and change and build back better and make America great again. They offer to lower the sea levels if you vote for them. They offer to end racism, end sexism. Tyrants promise the world, and they've been doing that since eternity past. And the masses fall for it every time. And what's the deal? What's the exchange? Well, for all those promises, We have to give up our God-given rights, our God-given sovereignty in exchange for those empty promises. Another threat that democracy brings is this idea of factions. Factions are groups of individuals that share interests and goals that may conflict with other groups. Now, in a democracy, these factions can become deeply polarized, and tyrants play them against each other. Men versus women, blacks versus whites, poor versus rich, white men versus every other thing. Think of factions like political parties or special interest groups. James Madison, in Federalist 10, discussed the dangers of factions and the potential for any group to become tyrannical if unchecked. He argued that a well-constructed union may mitigate the risks of tyranny by balancing various interests and preventing one faction from dominating. This is where we get the term the tyranny of the majority, which is also a poison pill in democracy. I've probably shared this before, and I share this in class all the time, and I attribute this to Ben Franklin, but Ben Franklin said democracy is 3 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner, right? So the 3 wolves are voting to eat the lamb. The lamb says no. Oh well, majority rules, officially dinner. Madison also said that an unchecked faction may contribute to the breakdown of social order, leading to anarchy. Boy, listen to this. In a system where multiple factions vie for control without a unifying mechanism, the result could be chaos, and it could lead to ineffective governance. What brings us all together, boys and girls, as Americans today? I don't know either. I shared this quote in class this week, and this is from Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams. And it's a lesser-known quote, but it's a great one. And she said, "Power, whether in the hands of the many or in the hands of the few, is always grasping for more. Like the grave, it cries out, more, more." This is the very reason, this rise of tyranny, that the founding fathers, including James Madison, who's known as the father of our Constitution, as well as others, looked towards Roman republicanism rather than Athenian democracy when designing the U.S. government. Republics are stable, and they help prevent tyranny and mob rule. The Roman Republic existed from around 509 to 27 BC, and it had a sophisticated system to prevent any one person from taking over. It had a senate, it had consuls, it had various magistrates, it had public assemblies, and they all shared power. This structure was designed to keep things balanced and ensure that no single entity could dominate. Influenced by this system, James Madison said, quote, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place." This means that Madison believed that by setting up a system where different branches of government could check each other's power, it would prevent any one branch or any one individual from becoming too dominant. But if we look at things today, the executive branch, it seems, has almost engulfed the other 2 branches by way of the massive unelected administrative bureaucracy. In fact, the original intention was that the legislative branch would be the most powerful of the 3, or at least the most significant. James Madison called the legislative branch the first branch of government. However, an easy argument could be made that the executive branch and the judicial, which has no real check on its power, have left Congress behind. Many of our problems in government today can be traced back to the Progressive era, where the ideas of more direct democracy were amended into the Constitution. And I've said this many times, the 17th Amendment granting direct election of senators pretty much erased any state sovereignty and protection from government overreach. Remember that with direct democracy like that of Athens, where decisions can be easily swayed by the whims of the majority, senators aren't incentivized to do what's right for their state. They're incentivized to stir up as much passion and dissent and whatever you want to call it to get their votes. They're there to promise things so that they can stay in power. The Roman-inspired American system was designed to be more stable. State legislatures were meant to pick the senators, and then if those senators didn't serve at the behest of the state, they could be recalled. This ensured that states had a place at the table, not the people. The state had a place at the table. It was meant to withstand the passions of the crowd on any particular outrage. The U.S. Constitution created a framework with checks and balances, ensuring that power would not be concentrated into one place. However, as I just alluded to, the Congress, especially the Senate, is nearly impotent in modern American governance today. Under the Constitution, the Senate is meant to ratify all treaties made between the U.S. and foreign nations. You history buffs might remember President Woodrow Wilson's embarrassing episode where the Senate struck down his beloved League of Nations. I bet that was the last time any president involved the Senate in such foreign policy matters. Today, presidents make executive agreements. This bypasses any Senate oversight. The only real thing the Senate does today of any relevance is they approve federal appointments like judges or political posts like the Secretary of State. The rest of the time, they simply cater to the masses in their state in order to remain in power. And mind you, the interests of the masses and the interests of the state may not be exactly the same. Alrighty, folks, that's a wrap for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was quick, but I hope you enjoyed diving into some ancient Greek and ancient Roman ideas about government and how those have echoed through our own political system today. And hopefully you see that the dangers of democracy, where you can get tyrants like the ones we mentioned, how they work their way, they exploit the passions of the factions, and they work their way to power. These people use the very systems meant to serve the people to consolidate their own control, showing us that power, when unchecked, has a way of concentrating itself. But we were not left as unintended babies on the side of the road. We do have a constitution, ladies and gentlemen. It still works if we can teach people about it and hold our elected officials to the fire. If we look at the political scene today, it's clear that the balance that Madison hoped for is a little off kilter. Power has become more centralized, and the branches aren't always doing their job keeping each other honest. And so it's up to us. And talking about us, we have to vote on policy. We cannot vote for personality. We can't vote for the cult of personality. We have to look at the facts. Which candidate is more in line with the American system, and which candidate is lying just to become president and then serve themselves. This is a quandary. This is a challenge of all time. Like I said, eternity past, people have been dealing with these challenges of democracy. So until next time, go throughout the land and don't proclaim democracy. Proclaim liberty.